The History of Rome. This monumental work by Theodor Mommsen, originally published in the 19th century, remains one of the most authoritative and influential accounts of early Roman history, and helped earn him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1902. Mommsen brings a legal scholar's rigor and a historian's narrative flair to the task of reconstructing Rome's foundational period. He examines the political structures, religious institutions, and social dynamics that shaped the Roman state, weaving in analysis of archaeological, linguistic, and mythological evidence. Central themes include the struggles between patricians and plebeians, Rome's conflicts with neighboring peoples like the Etruscans and Latins, and the gradual consolidation of Roman political power. Part 1. The Mediterranean Sea. From the very outset, Theodor Mommsen is clear. Rome cannot be understood without the Mediterranean, not as a scenic backdrop or incidental geography, but as the central axis around which ancient civilization revolved. In this inland sea, he sees more than water. He sees a system, a mechanism of exchange, of conflict, and of cultural fermentation. The Mediterranean was not a frontier to be crossed, but a thoroughfare, binding the coasts of Europe, Africa, and Asia into a single, restless orbit. Mommsen divides the ancient world into four civilizational spheres. To the south, the Egyptians, shaped by the unyielding rhythm of the Nile. To the east, the Syrians, trading and transmitting knowledge across the Levant. To the northeast, the Greeks, whose restless intellects would define the classical world. And finally, to the northwest, the Italians, less sophisticated perhaps, but destined to endure. Each of these peoples developed in relative autonomy, but the sea ensured that no one remained untouched. Ships, whether for trade or war, moved more rapidly than armies ever could. Along with them came stories, deities, inventions, and disease. Rome would not be a passive recipient in this system. It would eventually dominate it. But in the beginning, it was one player among many. Mommsen insists that to grasp the origins of Rome, we must view Italy not as an isolated peninsula, but as a participant in a Mediterranean system of civilizations. The cultural influences of the Etruscans to the north, the Greeks in the south, and even the Carthaginians to the west, were not marginal, they were formative. What made the Italians distinctive, in Mommsen's view, was not an original genius, but an instinct for assimilation and adaptation. The Latins would borrow, synthesize, and institutionalize. The genius of Rome was legal, structural, administrative, and it emerged slowly, molded by centuries of exposure to older and more refined cultures. The historical method Mommsen employs is itself part of the argument. He rejects the mythic narrative inherited from Livy or Virgil. For him, Rome's rise is not a matter of divine will or heroic founding acts. It is the product of observable forces, geography, demography, economy, and, above all, cultural contact. And it begins here, in the Mediterranean, where four civilizations watched each other warily across the water, until one, shaped by many, rose to rule them all. Part 2. Italy. Italy, in Mommsen's analysis, begins not with myth, but with silence. Unlike the stone circles of Britain or the burial mounds of the Danube, prehistoric Italy speaks faintly. Its earliest inhabitants left no legends, no temples, and few artifacts. But that silence, Mommsen insists, should not be mistaken for emptiness. The peninsula was not untouched. It was a corridor, a space of movement, shaped by successive waves of migration long before Rome was even imagined. Mommsen identifies three distinct populations in early Italy. The first, and most obscure, were the Iapygians, perhaps connected to the Illyrians across the Adriatic. They settled in the southeast, leaving behind little more than their name and scattered burial grounds. Their role in Italy's deeper prehistory is more archaeological than cultural, foundational but ghost-like. Then come the Etruscans. Their origins are the subject of scholarly contention even in Mommsen's time. Some saw them as migrants from Lydia in Asia Minor, others as a native evolution within the Italian soil. Their language, non-Indo-European, stood apart from the linguistic families that would later dominate the region. What is clear, however, is their impact in architecture, in religion, in symbols of power. The Etruscans are not Rome's ancestors, but they are its educators. And finally, the Italians themselves. By this, Mommsen means the Indo-European migrants, the people who brought with them the seeds of the Latin and Sabellian languages, ancestors of the Romans and the Samnites. They entered from the north, filtered through the Alpine passes, or descended along the Adriatic coast, bringing agriculture, animal husbandry, and metal tools. Their culture, unlike that of the Etruscans, was neither urban nor monumental. It was tribal, patriarchal, and rural, but it was durable. They would become the Latins, the Umbrians, the Oscans. They would shape the institutions of the Roman state before it had a name. Language is key for Mommsen. He sees philology not as an accessory to history, but as one of its most reliable witnesses. In vocabulary, in syntax, in borrowed terms and preserved roots, he finds the trail of migrations. Through these linguistic traces, he reconstructs Italy's transformation from a land of scattered peoples to a matrix of emerging identities. What Mommsen offers here is not a story of conquest, but of layering, one culture atop another, one language blending into the next. Italy was not born Latin. It became Latin, slowly, unevenly, and under the weight of older, sometimes forgotten, traditions. Part 3. Peoples before Rome. Before the city, before the Republic, before the name Rome meant anything at all, there was movement. Peoples flowed into the peninsula, and in their wake, they left the raw material of history. By the time the Latins appear in the historical record, they are already settled, not nomads, not invaders, but cultivators of the land between the Tiber River and the Alban Hills. Their villages, the low hills of Latium, independent yet tied by kinship, religion, and language. For Mommsen, these Latin communities are not remarkable for their originality, but for their cohesion. They speak a dialect of the Indo-European family, clear enough in structure to trace back to a broader linguistic ancestry, yet distinct enough to mark them off from their Oscan and Umbrian neighbors. This unity of tongue is no accident. It reflects a deeper social unity, an ethnic core shaped by shared descent and mutual recognition. But Latium is not a political entity. It is a patchwork. The Latin tribes, Mommsen refers to them as cantons, each govern themselves through their own assemblies, led by their own elders. There are no kings of Latium, only local chiefs, and no city is yet dominant. Still, the Latins were not isolated. To the north, they border the Etruscans, to the east, the Sabines and Equi, to the south, the Volsci and Hernesii. From these peoples they borrow, resist, intermarry, and trade. The cultural boundary is porous, but the ethnic identity holds. Their economy, modest and agrarian, centers around grain, cattle, and olives. Property is not held in common, but divided among clans. The household, the domus, is both economic unit and legal foundation. Authority lies with the paterfamilias, and law begins at home. Mommsen pays close attention to the institutions that begin to form in this early period. Embryonic versions of the Roman gens, or clan, and the early religious rites that will one day be codified into state cults. Latin religion is already formal, bound by augury, by the cult of hearth and ancestors, by oaths that have the force of law. Sacred and civil life are not yet distinct. The Latin people were not especially inventive, nor particularly philosophical, but they were stable, disciplined, and conservative. Mommsen sees in them the temperament that will come to define Rome, not in a single hero or founder, but in the collective instincts of a farming people, a preference for the concrete, a distrust of novelty, a reverence for order. They did not build temples to reason or sculpt epics in marble. They built fences. They dug ditches. They measured their fields. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork, literally, for the city that would one day govern the world. The Latin canton was a village on a hill, surrounded by fields, ringed by enemies, and tied to its neighbors by shared rights. There was no Rome yet, only potential, rooted in habit, in language, and in land. Part 4. The origins of Rome. Rome's beginning, Mommsen tells us, is not to be found in myth or monument, but in geography, in the land itself, and in the choices early communities made within it. The site of ancient Rome was far from ideal. The hills were rugged, the lowlands marshy, the water supply limited, and the Tiber River unpredictable, often swelling in floods that rendered its banks unstable. There were more fertile plains in Etruria, better harbors in Campania, and safer hilltop fortresses throughout Latium. And yet, this was the place where a city would rise that would outlast all others. Mommsen's answer lies in strategic necessity. The early Latin tribes were not seeking grandeur. They were securing advantage. Rome stood at a key transition point, where the inland routes of the Latin interior met the fluvial highway of the Tiber. From here, one could monitor trade between Etruscans and Campanians, control movement between the hills and the sea, and serve as a nodal point for commerce across the region. It was not the richness of the land, but the richness of its connections that mattered. Equally significant was the fording point across the Tiber, where goods and people could cross from the Latin right bank to the Etruscan left. This made the site militarily sensitive and economically desirable. The famed Salt Road, the Via Salaria, passed through this area, ensuring that Rome was not a terminus, but a crossroads. This placement was not accidental, nor romantic. It was calculated. The earliest settlers clustered not because of divine instruction, but because of practical advantage. What seems improbable from a purely environmental perspective becomes obvious when seen through a geopolitical lens. Mommsen strips away the mythology of heroic foundation and focuses on the logic of terrain. Rome was not chosen by the gods. It was chosen by those who understood the lay of the land. The result was a city that, from its inception, was positioned to mediate, to command, and to endure, not because of what it was, but because of where it stood. Before there was a city called Rome, there were hills, scattered high grounds, each occupied by its own small settlement. These early clusters were not yet urban, and certainly not unified, but they were not primitive either. They held the rudiments of organization, ritual, and memory. The Palatine Hill was likely the first to consolidate. Mommsen refers to it as Roma Quadrata, the squared Rome, possibly marked out ritually with furrow and plow. It wasn't a city in the modern sense, but a central point, a symbolic heart of a still-forming organism. Surrounding hills, the Esquiline, the Celian, the Aventine, each hosted their own communities. They had altars, burial grounds, communal granaries, and, critically, their own identities. Yet proximity forced negotiation. Rituals began to overlap, alliances formed, boundaries softened. What had been multiple sacred centers began to coalesce around a shared axis. One of the oldest markers of this consolidation was the mundus, a sacred pit thought to connect the world of the living to the underworld. Dug at the Palatine's center, it served as a ritual omphalos, a declaration that here, not elsewhere, the civic world would emerge. Mommsen also points to the celebration of the Septimontium, the festival of the Seven Hills. Not originally a Roman civic feast, it was a survival of an older, pre-urban structure, each hill honoring its own tutelary spirit, yet participating in a shared ritual calendar. That shared calendar becomes a political fact. It turns hills into districts and clans into citizens. Physical unity followed religious and military cooperation. Ditches became walls. Hilltop paths became roads. Communal rights were accompanied by decisions on defense, on land allocation, on justice. Urbanization, in this sense, was not the sudden rise of stone walls, but the slow layering of agreements. There was no founding day. There was no singular act of city building. There was only aggregation, codification, and eventually, formalization. Mommsen is clear. The early Roman state was not born out of nothing. It was not conjured by myth. It was the byproduct of intertribal negotiation, geography, and ritual consolidation. Rome's transformation from a ring of tribal settlements into a functioning urban community occurred not through conquest, but through a long process of institutional fusion. And at every stage, it bore the marks of compromise, memory, and continuity. What turned the settlements on the Tiber from clustered dwellings into an urban organism wasn't merely ritual or political consolidation, it was commerce. Rome's location, though unremarkable agriculturally, made it indispensable as an economic node. The Tiber was not a great river by volume or breadth, but it was navigable at precisely the point where Latin inland trade routes met the maritime routes of the Tyrrhenian Sea. That intersection gave Rome leverage over movement of goods, livestock, and eventually, people. At the foot of the Aventine Hill, the salt pans near the river's mouth became an early economic catalyst. Salt was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a preservative, a commodity required by every agricultural community in Latium. Control over the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, gave Rome more than wealth. It gave it relevance. Mommsen notes that this commercial role was visible even in the city's earliest institutional features. Rome adopted coinage before most of its Latin neighbors. It entered into transmarine treaties while others still operated within village law. It regulated weights, measures, and markets, not as an imperial project, but as a functional necessity of a trading center. In this phase, Rome was less a capital than an emporium, a site of regulated exchange. Its early walls weren't barriers against invasion, but markers of permanence. Its magistracies were not ceremonial but administrative, managing traffic, market disputes, and the fiscal demands of a growing economic hub. This commercial character was not incidental. It shaped the city's very structure. Foreigners were tolerated, even integrated, because trade required contact. Religious syncretism accelerated, because deities traveled with merchants. Contracts grew more complex, requiring forms of registration, notarization, and adjudication. These would later crystallize into Roman law. Urban growth, for Mommsen, was thus not a reflection of cultural superiority or divine favor. It was the rational result of Rome's economic function. The city grew because it had to, because goods moved, and someone needed to account for them. Even before the legions, before the Senate, before the mythos of Roman supremacy, there was the port, the market, the road, and the logic that bound them together. The early Roman state has often been misunderstood, misread through the lens of modern nationalism or filtered through the distortions of ancient legend. Mommsen confronts this directly. He does not deny Rome's composite origins, but he refuses to call it a hybrid in the pejorative sense. Rome, he argues, was not a racial amalgam or a cultural accident. It was a Latin state, structured by Latin law, grounded in Latin religion, and speaking Latin speech. Misreadings begin when the tripartite tribal structure, rams, titis, lus res, is interpreted as evidence of racial stratification. Later traditions assign ethnic identities to each, Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans, respectively. But Mommsen is cautious. He acknowledges these links as plausible, even likely, but he rejects the notion that early Rome was divided into competing ethnic enclaves. These tribes were political formations, not biological categories. The cultural markers of early Rome, as he catalogs them, are overwhelmingly Latin. The legal institutions, the familial structures, the terminology of governance and religion, they emerge from the Latin soil. The Sabine and Etruscan influences were real, but they were absorbed through proximity and alliance, not imposed through domination. The mistake, Mommsen suggests, lies in how Roman development has been framed, as if its early strength resided in its openness to foreign elements. What made Rome resilient was not eclecticism for its own sake, but a disciplined selectivity. It borrowed not randomly, but strategically. It integrated what it could institutionalize. The Etruscans, for example, contributed to the visual vocabulary of Roman authority, the lictors, the curule chair, the ceremonial fasces. But these were not adopted wholesale. They were filtered, modified, adapted to fit the Roman framework. Rome never became Etruscan, nor did it dissolve into Sabine or Greek forms. Its cultural identity was conservative in method, even when expansive in contact. Mommsen's Rome is not a melting pot. It is a civic construction, a polity that defined itself through law and ritual, not blood or myth. The endurance of that identity, he argues, is rooted in its clarity. Even as Rome expanded, even as it absorbed peoples and practices, it retained a sense of its own historical trajectory. And so, the early city was never a blank slate. It was a Latin organism, shaped at its margins by neighboring cultures, but coherent at its core. To misread that, says Mommsen, is to mistake diffusion for dissolution, and to underestimate the disciplined continuity that made Rome possible. Mommsen does more than reconstruct early Rome. He repositions how early Roman history should be written. His method marks a deliberate turn away from mythological embellishment and toward structural interpretation. For him, history is not the repetition of ancient tales. It is the analysis of causes, institutions, and enduring patterns. By discarding the legend of Romulus and instead tracing Rome's rise through geography, tribal consolidation, commercial activity, and legal development, Mommsen offers a framework that privileges systems over symbols. This was not common in his time. 19th-century historiography was still entangled in heroic narratives and national myths. Mommsen's work signaled a methodological shift, an insistence on reading history as a product of forces rather than fables. His rejection of racial essentialism, too, sets him apart. Where some of his contemporaries interpreted early Rome as a genetic mixture of alien tribes, Etruscan, Sabine, Pelasgian, Mommsen identifies Rome not as a product of racial fusion, but of political integration. He treats identity as legal and civic, not biological. This distinction is subtle but significant. It lays the groundwork for understanding Rome as a legal construct, defined by citizenship, duty, and office, not ancestry. His use of philology further cements his standing as a modern historian. He relies on linguistic evidence not to fill in gaps imaginatively, but to trace real historical developments, ethnic migration, cultural influence, institutional borrowing. The evolution of Latin as a language is, for him, a historical archive in its own right. Equally important is what Mommsen avoids. He does not attribute Rome's success to destiny, providence, or character. He avoids teleology. Rome's development is contingent, shaped by terrain, necessity, and negotiation. In doing so, he distances his narrative from the glorifications found in Livy or the imperial idealizations of later Roman historians. His Rome is not a fated empire. It is a constructed city, built from compromise and function. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.